Common Cause frames the effort as a power grab by, quote, wealthy special interests and radical far-right actors seeking to reshape the Constitution for their own benefit. They characterize the leadership as connected to Project 2025, if you remember that, before the Trump's election. Project 2025 was all in the news, and describe the effort as top-down and dark money funded rather than genuinely grassroots. Their core fear is that the convention could eliminate social safety net protections or entrench right-wing agenda permanently into the constitutional text.
Ultimately, this debate is about more than just term limits or balanced budgets or electoral systems. It's about whether constitutional change should occur through the Constitution or around it. One movement says the Constitution's outdated, it's inconvenient, and it has to be bypassed in order to achieve a desired outcome. The other says if change is necessary, then make the case openly, persuade the states, follow the constitutional process that the founders gave us. And I think that's a critically important distinction.
To Fire for Effect, episode 40, recording this on May 7th, Thursday, May 7th. And today we're going to be talking about Article 5 in the Convention of States, which is the people's final check on Washington. And you got myself, James McBride, and co-hosting with me, as always, is Marcus Moyer. How you doing, Marcus?
Outstanding.
Should be a good episode. This ties in really nicely with episode 39. So go watch episode 39 where we talk about the NPVIC, which is a designed and intended end around the Constitution to achieve certain objectives. And we'll talk about that a little bit again today. But today we're talking about Article 5, the Convention of States. So it is one of the most powerful and least understood provisions in the United States Constitution. A provision so significant that the founders included it as the people's final constitutional check on a federal government that someday might refuse to restrain itself. And the founders were absolutely convinced that day would come. For decades, Americans on the left and the right have watched Washington grow larger, more powerful, more indebted, more centralized. And we talked about the different philosophies between Hamilton and Madison a few episodes ago. Different views from the founders had on how centralized the federal government should be. And I think it's exceeded all of their expectations, even Hamilton's expectations in that regard. And it's become increasingly disconnected from the constitutional limits it was designed to operate within. The national debt has now surpassed $36 trillion. Unelected bureaucracies issue rules with the force of law. Congressional leaders serve for decades. Federal authority expands into nearly every area of American life, and elections alone have done very little to reverse the trend. We've talked about how the popularity of Congress is at record lows, but the re-election rate of Congress members is like in the 90%, something to that effect, on average. So the question becomes, what happens when the federal government no longer willingly limits itself? Which the founders were trying to prevent from happening because they recognized human nature, and human nature has overcome the restrictions that were designed by the founders. The desire for greed and power and the easy path has led to too much power in the federal government. So what happens when the system designed to check power becomes the very thing accumulating it? The founders asked themselves that exact question in Philadelphia in 1787. And their answer became Article 5 of the Constitution. Most Americans know the Constitution can be amended through Congress. Far fewer realize the Constitution contains a second pathway, a pathway that belongs not to Washington, but to the states. Article 5 in the Constitution declares that when 2/3 of the state legislatures apply for it, Congress shall call a convention for proposing constitutional amendments. Not may, but shall. It is one of the only places in the Constitution where the federal government is commanded to act at the direction of the states. And today, we're examining the growing movement attempting to use that constitutional mechanism right now, called the Convention of States movement. Its supporters argue that the federal government has escaped its constitutional boundaries and that Article 5 is the constitutional remedy the founders intentionally provided for this exact moment. Its critics warn that such a convention could become dangerous or unpredictable, even a runaway convention. And hanging over all of it is a larger constitutional question we explored in our previous episode, episode 39, on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, NPVIC. Because what we're really talking about today is not just political reform. We're talking about two radically different philosophies for changing the American system itself. One movement seeks to fundamentally alter presidential elections and their outcomes through an interstate compact without using the constitutional amendment process. The other seeks to amend the Constitution through the exact mechanism the Constitution itself prescribes. Two movements, two maps, which we'll show you later in this episode, two visions of federalism, and two very different answers to the question, how should constitutional change happen in America? The founders gave us a process for peaceful reform because they understood the alternative. They understood that when people lose faith that constitutional systems can correct themselves, history becomes very dangerous. And perhaps that's why James Madison wrote these words in Federalist number 43. The state legislatures will have equal authority with the Congress to originate the amendment of errors. Today we ask, was Article 5 intended for a moment exactly like we see today? And if so, does this generation still possess the courage to use it? Welcome to Fire for Effect, episode 40. And let's begin.
Man, way to load up the episode, man. This is such an interesting topic, and it's, as you said in the opening there, it's not very well understood by so many people. And I can't exclude myself from that, because until I dove down this rabbit hole several years ago, I think you mentioned this to me. It's the first time I'd heard of it. And there's an interview on Tucker Carlson today when he was still on Fox Nation with Mark Meckler, which is the impetus for a lot of what we're going to talk about today. I think that was the first time I'd heard of it. And that was, what was that interview, 2-3 years ago, maybe?
At least that, yeah. 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. And so that was my first introduction to the idea of a convention of states. And it's not because I hadn't read the Constitution before. I'd read it many times, even at that point. But I guess I hadn't really fully understood what that article was talking about. But Article 5 of the United States Constitution establishes, as you said, there's two pathways by which the Constitution could be amended. The first, and the only method that we've ever used in our history to date for the 27 amendments that we have, that first option for amending the Constitution runs through Congress, where 2/3 of both House and Senate have to approve a proposed amendment, which then goes to the states for ratification by 3/4, or 38 of the states have to ratify anything that is proposed before it becomes part of the Constitution. The second pathway, though, the one that we're talking about today, was written by the founders specifically for the moment that many would argue, and I think I include myself in this, many would argue we're living in that moment right now. The second pathway outlined in Article 5 reads as follows: that on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So the common thread between those two different pathways, the states are the ultimate arbiters at the end. Regardless of how an amendment gets put on the table, the final hurdle wicket that it has to pass through is 3/4 of the state legislatures have to agree to it. So in plain terms, if 34 state legislatures pass resolutions calling for a convention, Congress is constitutionally required to convene one. And the convention can propose amendments to the Constitution, but those amendments only become law if ratified by 38 states. The federal government has no veto. Congress can't block it. The president can't stop it. It is the one tool in the constitutional toolbox that belongs entirely to the states and the people. And that's federalism at its finest, I would argue. So why did the founders put it there? Again, it's always helpful and instructive to understand the thought and the intent behind what the founders did. And one of the best places to go to discover that is the Federalist Papers. We spent a lot of time talking about Madison and Hamilton, and most of that came from the Federalist Papers. So it's a great companion to the Constitution. If you're ever curious why something is or isn't in the Constitution, Federalist Papers is a great way to start. James Madison explained that the purpose for this particular provision, Article 5, he explained that in Federalist number 43, and this is what he said. He said, "It was thought unwise to deprive the states of the opportunity of proposing amendments by 2/3 of the legislatures, a safeguard against ambitious encroachments of the federal government on the authority of the state governments." Remember, that was a big concern of a lot of the states, that if they became part of this union, they were going to be, that their sovereignty was going to be stomped out and overrun. And that was especially a concern for many of the smaller states who felt like they were going to be beholden and basically held hostage by the larger states. So the founders were not naive. They built into the Constitution a mechanism for the states to address those concerns so that states could act as a check on the federal government, precisely because they anticipated that the federal government would eventually overstep its constitutional boundaries and that Congress would never vote to limit its own power. And again, arguably, that day has come. Washington seems to be completely unfettered and unchecked. As you'll see in a second, the consensus in many places of the country is that it does whatever it wants, and it doesn't seem like anyone or anything can stop it. And so making the case for a convention of states, as outlined in Article 5, is really founded in that view that the government has grown beyond its constitutional boundaries and is just running amok. The Convention of States project, which was co-founded by Mark Meckler and Michael Ferris in 2013, makes a very straightforward diagnosis that the federal government no longer operates within its constitutionally defined limits. And I think they make a very compelling case. The premise is that the issue is not a personnel problem, but a structural problem. Check out how Mark Meckler describes this in his own words.
In 2013, I was approached by a guy by the name of Mike Ferris. And Mike is the founder of the homeschool movement in America.
In Virginia.
Yep. A great man, founded HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, founded Patrick Henry College, great Christian college in Purcellville, Virginia. And he came to me and he asked me if I was happy about what I had accomplished in politics. And I told him I was miserable. And I spent all this time, spent all my money, and we put this class in and nothing happened. And he said, well, you're approaching the problem incorrectly. He said, you think we have a personnel problem in DC, and we don't. We have a structure problem. The founders understood that humans were fallible, humans were sinners, and they built a structure that worked even when filled with those kinds of humans. And we had broken the structure. And he explained that to me. It was mostly Supreme Court precedent for the last 115 years. It was the 17th Amendment, whereby we decided to directly elect senators instead of having them appointed by the states. There are all these structural problems we had introduced into the system that the framers created. And he said the only way to fix that is to use Article 5 of the Constitution, call a convention of states, and propose amendments to fix these problems. I was skeptical at first, just like you and pretty much everybody else that hears it. Spent about an hour on the phone with him, and I was convinced. And that's when, as an organization, we decided to take on the Convention of States project.
So the problem under the current structure is that the federal government does whatever it wants, and there seems to be little or nothing that ordinary citizens can do about it, quote unquote. Elections alone haven't seemed to reverse that trend, which is evident by, we probably all know somebody who has expressed that frustration to the extent that they're convinced that their vote doesn't even matter anymore. And so what's the point of participating in elections? It doesn't change anything. And the structural incentives in Washington, D.C. seem to reward expansion of power, not the restraint of it. And so that has produced a tremendous amount of frustration for the American people, yours truly included. And it's created a lot of tension around this idea of a convention of states.
Yeah, and a lot of the tension, a lot of the things we're bringing up is meant to alleviate the friction in America right now. A lot of these ideas you'll see throughout this episode will help rein in, again, federal power, too much federal power, but also make the country more fair as the founders intended, and ideally address a lot of the grievances that people have in the country today that are leading to a lot of the polarization.
Yeah, excellent point. And Mark Meckler speaks to that a little bit here as he and Tucker Carlson talk about that tension.
There's an intensity around the Convention of States as an idea that is really noticeable. There's a reason for that. So just explain, and I'm going to stay out of the way, what it is and why we need it.
Well, I'm going to start with the reason for the intensity, if I could.
Yeah.
You know, I know, and all of us who think like us know something is desperately wrong.
Yes.
We know that the federal government's broken, and we're frustrated because we have no idea how to fix it. And that creates a lot of intensity, that frustration, that anger, and that feeling that I don't know what to do about this thing. I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. So people are looking for solutions, and they tend to look to politicians. And the politicians, because they're humans, tend to disappoint. And so the answer is structural. It's found in the Constitution. And what the Constitution tells us in Article 5 is that there are two ways to amend the Constitution. First is the way that it's always been done, 27 amendments. Whenever 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose an amendment, then that amendment goes out to the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. That's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
So that was proposed in the Constitutional Convention in 1787. 2 days before the end of convention, Colonel George Mason from Virginia stands up and he says to the convention, we have a problem. We created this document. It gives Congress the power to propose amendments, but it doesn't give that to the people or the states. And he says, are we so naive that we actually believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny would ever propose amendments to restrain itself? I mean, it makes no sense. I think they probably laughed. I mean, we don't have videotape, obviously, but we have Madison's notes. And Madison's notes at that point say two Latin abbreviations. They say nin com, which stands for no comment. Not one guy in that convention objected to what Mason said. It was so obvious to all of them. It was a forehead slap moment. They all just thought, oh, yeah, of course we got to do this. And unanimously, they put this second power in. And that's
so in other words, if Congress had the only way to change the Constitution was to get the consent of Congress. But if Congress is rotten, why would Congress ever
correct
reform itself? It never would.
They love it just how it is. Why would they limit their own terms? Why would they impose any kind of fiscal restraints on themselves? Why would they limit their power in any way? That's not human, by the way. That's just human nature. We like power, right?
That's right.
So we don't give away power naturally. It has to be taken from us or limited in some way.
So there's the problem that Mark Meckler presents. An out-of-control federal government that needs to be reined in. And the data is difficult to argue with on that point. As you mentioned, Jim, the national debt has now surpassed $36 trillion. It's more than doubled since 2013 when the Convention of States first launched. And the debt to GDP ratio has exceeded 100%, I believe, for the first time since World War II. Or World War XI, if you're Ilhan Omar. The federal regulatory state has produced tens of thousands of pages of new rules annually. I mean, they just churn this stuff out. The vast majority of those rules are written by unelected bureaucrats who have no direct accountability to the voters. We mentioned that before too, that frustration of people, like they feel like they're being, for lack of a better word, oppressed, but they don't have access to the people who are to blame, because it's not really their congressman, because to the point here, it's these unelected bureaucrats, these regulatory agencies who are passing all of these rules and regulations that carry the effect of law, but they're not elected lawmakers. And so people feel like they don't have access to the people that are making their lives difficult, and hence even further frustration. Federal power has expanded dramatically through expansive interpretations by the Supreme Court of things like the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. We talked about that in a previous episode as well. I think it was during the Hamilton and Madison episodes. But the way that the courts have interpreted those clauses go far beyond what the founders ever intended for the text to support. The members of Congress routinely, you also mentioned this, they serve for decades. I should have looked it up. I don't know who the longest serving member of Congress is right now, but I mean, I think it's probably 40 years or more. So these people, they stay in D.C., it becomes a career for them, and they accumulate power and just become career political operators, totally insulated from the consequences of their decisions. And so the Convention of States approaches that problem, again, as a structural problem, not just a personnel problem. In the Convention of States, they have three core objectives. Their model resolution calls for a convention that strictly limits itself to proposing amendments in three, what they call subject areas. And here's what Mark Meckler has to say about those subject areas and what the purpose and goal of the Convention of State movement actually is.
So can you just restate with specificity what kinds of changes you would like to see that convention make?
Yeah, so one of the things we do as an organization is we're not proposing specific amendments. These are subject matter area amendments or proposals, but I can give you some examples. Yeah. So first is, let's talk about fiscal restraints. So one is a balanced budget amendment. Every year, the federal government spends more money than the year before. The exception to that, there's only one in all of American history. That's the Coolidge administration, right? Other than that, every administration has grown the size and scope of the federal government. So the only way you're going to get them to limit their spending is by forcing them to limit their spending. Right. So some form of balanced budget amendment. That could be, again, tied to spending caps and tax caps. I think those things are important. Otherwise, they just say, okay, Tucker, we'll just tax you to death, right? Right. And that's how we'll balance. So you get tax caps and spending caps, and there are other fiscal restraints on them. Like baseline budgeting would be a good one. Every year, most people don't realize the way the federal government works is they say if they don't raise it 4 or 6%, then that's a cut. Right. It's not a cut, obviously, but they'll scream and yell about that being a cut. So we could go to baseline budgeting, where whatever they had last year is the baseline, and if they're going to raise it, they're going to raise it. If they're going to cut it, they're going to cut it from what they did last year. So a bunch of fiscal tools we have. Second is anything that would impose term limits. About 80 to 85% of the American public are in support of term limits for Congress. And by the way, have been for 30 years, proving that they'll never do this to themselves. And so we could impose term limits on them, on the House and the Senate, but importantly, possibly on judiciary, possibly, I think the Supreme Court needs some form of term limits. It'd be a healthier system. They would turn over more rapidly, and we would know that not every Supreme Court justice fight is an existential fight. Well, that's right. So that's term limits, but also staff and bureaucracy. And I think this is a really fundamental problem that we have in DC. You spent a bunch of time there. I mean, these offices, the congressmen's offices, are run by staffers. The staffers 100%. That run the committees are super powerful. The bureaucrats are even more powerful. People who've been there 20 or 30 years in Washington, D.C., they hold all the levers of power, and really Congress is almost answerable to them. They've abrogated their authority. So if we limit them to the same kinds of terms that you limit congressmen to and senators to, we'd have a much more healthy rotation in office in Washington. So that'd prevent a Fauci from happening. Absolutely. I mean, he's been there, I don't know, 5 presidents, isn't that? Yeah, like 40 years. Yeah. So yeah, that's ridiculous. That should never happen. And the American people agree with that. Finally, and this is the most important one to me, is limits on scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. We all complain that the federal government does too much. It's too involved in our lives. We've polled this. It's about 72% of Americans say the federal government's too big and does too much. Now, we might disagree on a partisan basis what's too big and which areas they do too much in, but we all agree it's too big and they do too much. And if you look at the areas in which they really have no authority, they were never supposed to be involved in education or energy or healthcare or food production, agriculture, all of this stuff. None of that's in the Constitution. There's not a person alive that can point to me in the Constitution where that stuff is authorized. That's all been authorized by the United States Supreme Court, expanding federal government power. And if you think about everything I just mentioned, every state has all of those departments. Why do we need the federal government telling us the same stuff?
Great point.
You know, and here's a little piece of constitutional history and founding history. We all know the fight between Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson's a small government agrarian. Hamilton is a big government guy, right? That's the quintessential fight between the vision for America.
One's from New York City, one's from rural Virginia.
Exactly. And so what you look at that fight, and then the question is, did they agree on anything? And there is something really fundamental they agreed on. And they agreed on something called exclusive spheres of influence. They said, if the federal government can do it, then the states can't, and vice versa. And it made sense because no man can possibly answer to two masters. How can you know what the federal government wants you to do? The states, and in our case now, it's federal government, it's state, it's county, it's local, and you're supposed to comply with all these, say, environmental regulations.
Sure. And the duplication of effort is also like crazy.
It's ridiculous. And so we need to go back to that, take all that power away from the federal government, and we can do this with the third leg in scope, jurisdiction, and powers of the federal government. Say to the federal government, nope, you can't be involved in education. That's a state-based thing. I think it's local. It should go to the states and let the states push it down to the local level. It shouldn't be a federal government thing. Since we spent hundreds of billions of dollars on education at the Department of Education, we literally have no improvement in the educational status of our children. That's the best case.
So the three things he laid out there, these subject areas that are the objectives for the Convention of States: fiscal restraints on the federal government, a balanced budget amendment that would require the federal government to operate within its means, as 49 of the 50 states are already required to do. It would force Congress to make hard choices that officials currently avoid just by borrowing more money, printing more money. And that's arguably the single most structurally important reform available given the trajectory of the national debt, which I believe, and I've heard many other people talk about this as well, represents one of the biggest threats to national security that we face at the moment. The second subject area that was laid out there is the limits on federal power and jurisdiction. Amendments in this category would clarify the limits of federal authority under the clauses that have been expanded far beyond their original meaning, including the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause. They could also create stronger mechanisms for states to push back against unfunded federal mandates and regulatory overreach. So essentially, almost all of what the Convention of States is advocating for, and the types of amendments that they're hoping to pass, are aimed at clarifying and rolling back federal expansion that has been made possible by judicial activism over the last 100 years. And then the third leg that he mentioned there is congressional term limits. Currently enjoy broad partisan public support, consistently polling over 70 to 80% nationally, as you mentioned earlier, Jim. The American people overwhelmingly seem to support the idea of term limits, and yet somehow, in a weird fit of cognitive dissonance, the American people still elect reincumbents at a rate greater than 90%. But the Convention of State argument is simple, that career politicians who have spent 20, 30, 40 years in Washington are not the same citizen legislators that the founders envisioned. And term limits would help restore rotation in the offices, reduce the entrenchment of institutional power, and bring fresh perspectives to the legislative process. And not just term limits for Congress, but term limits for the Supreme Court justices, was Mark Meckler's point, and term limits for the bureaucracy, which I thought was very interesting. That, to me, would be a little bit more difficult, simply for continuity in some of these offices. Oftentimes, they'll use the excuse, well, we got to keep these people around because they know how the system works. And my rebuttal to that is, like, do they know how the system works, or did they just know how to work the system? Which seems to be the case in many cases. But the fact that he mentioned that these congressional offices are really run by the staff, it reminded me of what we talked about with Rob Hartwell a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about, if you remember, I specifically asked the question, who on Capitol Hill is standing in the way of us taking meaningful action to protect our electrical grid against the threat of electromagnetic pulses? And if you remember, Rob Hartwell, he thought about it for a second, and then his answer was the staff. And he was a little bit worried that he might get in trouble for saying that. But it makes Mark Meckler's point, is that these congressional officers are not so much run by the congressmen and women, but they're run by the staff. And as Rob Hartwell said, expressed, they are sometimes an obstacle to doing things that seem very obvious and reasonable to do. So that's what the Convention of States hopes to accomplish. That's what the movement is after. The details of how we go about it is a little bit vague in many people's mind, even people who are aware of what the Convention of States is. And one of the major objections is like Article 5 of the Constitution lays out this provision that permits a convention of state, but it doesn't say anything about how you would execute that. And so where the delegates come from, what the scope of the convention would be, that sort of thing. And so the question that comes up is like, how would we do this? And so my question then is, well, have we ever tried? Has this idea ever been tested, either for real or at least in theory?
And it has. That's what's great about this movement is they're very deliberative and very thoughtful, and they've tested it out. So back in the Convention of States organization held a simulated Article 5 convention in Williamsburg, Virginia, back in 2016, with 137 delegates representing all 50 states. And the simulation demonstrated that a convention would conduct orderly, limited deliberations. The simulation convention proposed amendments covering 6 specific topics: a requirement for state approval of national debt increases, congressional term limits, restrictions on the Commerce Clause's scope, limits on the power of federal regulations, a supermajority requirement for federal tax increases, and repeal of the 16th Amendment, which is the federal income tax, which would make a lot of people happy. A second simulation was held in 2023, so very, very recently, also in Williamsburg.
I remember that.
And oh, you do? Okay, yeah, because you're up in that area. And it had very similar results. So they've tested it twice, and it's proven to be very orderly, methodical, thoughtful, taking in all arguments, perspectives, and both times had very similar results. So in military fashion, they tested it out, they trained, they did, equivalent of a tabletop exercise, not once but twice, and it's shown that it works.
Yeah. At one point, I know they did televise that event in Williamsburg, and at one point there was a link that people could use to go to, and you could watch the whole convention. Really? I watched part of it, but I was it's probably still out there.
Yeah,
because I remember I watched an hour or two of it, but I was also active duty at the time, so I had other work that I had to do. So as fascinated as I was by it, I didn't get to spend nearly the time that I wanted to watching that. But we'll see if we can find the link, and if it's still an active link and people can still do that, we'll post it here if anybody's interested in going and watching it.
Was that before or after discovering this Mark Meckler's interview with Tucker? Do you remember?
After.
Right afterwards. Okay, so great timing.
Yeah. Fascinating.
That's cool.
Go ahead.
So where the movement stands now, this graphic here is a Convention of States graphic showing the states that have passed it, and the states that are currently considering it. And there's 34 states total that are required to be able to call a Convention of States. So as of early 2026, the Convention of States resolution has been passed by 20 state legislatures, with Kansas becoming the 20th in 2026. So the movement is fresh. It's moving. It's good news. 14 more states are needed to reach the 34 state threshold required to call the convention. States actively considering the resolution in 2026 include Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming. And states where the resolution has passed one chamber but not the other include New Mexico, Iowa, South Dakota, Virginia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, and Wyoming. The movement boasts over 5 million supporters and petition signers with representation in every single state legislative district in the country. This is a cross-party lines movement. If you notice, a lot of the states that I've mentioned that are considering it are typically blue states or currently blue states. And of the states that passed it, Wisconsin was become recently kind of a swing state, but that's been a blue state in recent memory. And right now, Virginia is a purple blue state that's considering it. New Hampshire's considering it. So you see the broad appeal to this, because again, it's not meant to address conservative grievances. It's meant to address grievances that apply to everybody, that all of us should be concerned about. And that's the point. This movement wants it to include everybody to take part in this, to have a true free speech, debate, and deliberation on these topics, and come up with a solution that's best for the country.
Yeah, and Mark Meckler makes that point in that interview with Tucker Carlson. People can go to Fox Nation and watch the whole interview. I would encourage them to do that. He makes the point that this is good for the states, especially if you're a fan of federalism, because it gives every state more power to do what they want in their state.
If you're in California and you're a California liberal, you should want this, because what it means is California gets more power, and that legislature can be more liberal. New York gets more power and can be more liberal. And the conservative states get more power and can be more conservative. We go back to federalism, which means we all get more of what we want state by state.
And so whether you're a liberal in California or you're a conservative in Texas, whatever you want more of in your state, this gives you the ability to do it. Instead of having the federal government tell everybody across the entire country, you all have to be the same, which is not the way that this experiment was supposed to go.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because very recently, and I don't remember the name of the case, but the recent Supreme Court decision that just was passed down last week, I think, allowing the states more freedom in their redistricting, basically ruling down the idea of districting by race, eliminating that as a consideration, allows a lot of the states to redistrict, which analysis is still being done by a lot of different political pundits. But one prevailing theory right now is that blue states will become more blue and red states will become more red, whether that's good or bad. To your point, if a state is predominantly, one political persuasion, they will have more rights and freedom under a potential result of a convention of states, both whether you're a conservative state or a left-leaning state. So the point being, more state rights and individual influence for each individual state, rather than the federal government having too much power dictating what the states do. So, we've mentioned the 10th Amendment 100 times in this series, but the states are supposed to have much more autonomy in our government. So let's go back in history a little bit here. So the founding fathers anticipated exactly this moment, which we mentioned in the opening. The inclusion of the state-led amendment pathway was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate, debated provision inserted specifically because the founders anticipated that the federal government would eventually become the problem rather than the solution, and that asking Congress to fix itself would be futile. So George Mason, in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 said, "The proposing of amendments is in both modes to depend, in the first immediately, and in the second ultimately, on Congress, which may abuse their power and refuse their consent on that very account." Mason was the primary advocate for the state-led convention pathway at the Philadelphia Convention. He refused to sign the Constitution in part because the original draft did not include it. His insistence led to the addition of the state application mechanism in the final text. Mason understood that Congress would never propose amendments that genuinely limited congressional power, and he was right. Again, the founders were very keenly aware of human nature. And Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 85, he said, "The national rulers will have no option upon the subject. By the 5th article of the plan, the Congress will be obliged, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, to call a convention for proposing amendments." And remember, this is a correction that I made in an earlier episode, that the Federalist Papers were written after the Constitutional Convention for the Constitution. So the founders, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, were Publius, and they were writing after the convention to argue for different points of the draft Constitution so that it would be ratified. And Hamilton's point there is unambiguous. The state-led convention is not optional for Congress. It's a constitutional mandate. When 34 states apply, Congress, again, quote, "shall call the convention." The word "shall" is obligatory, not discretionary. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Samuel Kercheval in 1816, he wrote, "Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors." Jefferson was a consistent advocate for the ability of living generations to reform their government. He would have been appalled by a federal government that has expanded so far beyond its constitutional boundaries that it cannot be reined in through ordinary electoral politics. And as we pointed out, as would Hamilton be appalled. I'm sorry, as would Madison be appalled. And I think even Hamilton would be appalled, even though he was for stronger federal government. But I think even he would be appalled at how far that's gone.
Yep.
The Convention of States mechanism is precisely the kind of structural reform Jefferson believed each generation had the right and the duty to pursue. And then James Madison, in Federalist number 51, wrote in 1788, "The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others." So Madison's design relied on ambition counteracting ambition. The state's ambition for their own power checking the federal government's ambition for more. The Convention of States mechanism is the constitutional expression of that principle. It is Madison's design working as intended.
So that all makes a really compelling case, I think, for a convention of states. But it's disingenuous to pretend that there aren't other alternative perspectives on this. Just as with the Electoral College, reasonable people can agree or disagree with the merits of a thing. And so I think it's in the interest of intellectual honesty, we have to at least acknowledge that there is another side of this, that there are reasonable people who have objections and what those objections are. Some of those objections are more reasonable, I think, than others, and we'll explore some of those. Steelmanning the argument, if you will. The most serious objection, I think, that is raised by opponents including organizations like Common Cause, the John Birch Society, Eagle Forum, and some other conservative voices. That objection is what they refer to as a runaway convention. And that's the fear that once a convention is called, that its delegates could disregard their limited mandate and propose a sweeping change to the entire Constitution, including eliminating some or all of the Bill of Rights or restructuring the entire government. And so, again, that objection is typically referred to as a runaway convention.
This is a really important point, Tucker. I hear people all the time, they're terrified of getting into convention. Who knows what might happen in a convention? All you do in convention is make a suggestion. And then that suggestion has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, 38 states, before it becomes part of the Constitution. So that's the process.
Okay. So it's a multi-step process.
Correct.
So first they agree to meet, then they propose changes, and then they have another vote.
That's correct. Then the states actually go out and vote themselves out in the states.
So the objection that is being discussed here, Common Cause frames that as follows, quote, "There are absolutely no rules for an Article 5 convention outlined in the Constitution. There's nothing that could limit the convention to a single issue, so the delegates could write amendments that revoke any of our most cherished rights," unquote. Idaho Republican leaders have similarly argued that the convention, quote, "opens a Pandora's box that we might never be able to close, and that the law of unintended consequences applies." Even some conservatives who share the Convention of States goals have expressed a concern, noting that the Republican National Convention has maintained a standing resolution opposing Article 5, an Article 5 convention, since at least as early as 2012, and that the Idaho GOP passed a resolution opposing it at their 2025 summer meeting. There is, while there is bipartisan support for this idea, there also seems to be some bipartisan opposition as well. The Convention of State response, though, is that there are multiple redundant safeguards, as Mark Meckler mentioned in his interview. The Convention of States project has directly and extensively tried to address this concern, and their response rests on several interlocking arguments. The first being that the scope of a Convention of States is defined by the application. Madison himself addressed that in Federalist number 40, when he argued that the scope of a convention, quote, "ought in strictness to be determined by an inspection of the commissioners given to the members by their respective constituents," unquote, meaning that the state legislatures have a role to play in defining the limits of what is going to be done at this convention. The Convention of States model resolution is narrowly and very specifically worded, calling only for amendments addressing fiscal constraints, power limitations, and term limits. And as we heard Mark Meckler say earlier, the Convention of States movement, his movement, is not proposing wording for a specific amendment. He's just saying that any amendment that would be proposed at a Convention of States should fall into one of those three subject areas. Second, delegates can be recalled and replaced. State legislatures retain the authority to recall and replace any delegate who exceeds their mandate. A delegate who would have attempted to move the convention beyond its stated scope could immediately be pulled back and replaced by the state. So that's more than just a theoretical protection. That's a structural safeguard that's built into the appointment process. The third rebuttal that the Convention of States movement offers to its opponents is the ratification firewall. And this is probably, in my mind, the greatest safeguard, the most powerful safeguard of all of them. And it's built directly into Article 5 and requires that any amendment that's proposed by the convention, regardless of what it says, then has to be ratified by 38 states in order to become law. 3/4 of the states have to ratify whatever amendment comes out of that convention before it can become part of the Constitution. So it only takes 13 states out of 50 to say no. And if they do, then nothing changes. As Mark Meckler said, all the convention can do is make suggestions. And at the end of the day, 3/4 of the states have to agree to whatever that suggestion is before it becomes part of the Constitution. So the idea that a runaway convention could single-handedly dismantle the Constitution ignores that fact that 38 state legislatures would have to affirmatively agree to each proposed amendment. So the Constitution cannot be rewritten by the convention itself. It can only propose changes that the states must then ratify. And so I heard Mark Meckler say at one point, I don't know if it was in this interview or if I heard him somewhere else, he said that when people bring up this objection of a runaway state and that somehow they might lose some portion of the Constitution or a bill of one of the rights in the Bill of Rights, he says the challenge that he's always issued, and no one's taken him up on it, is he will tell these individuals, you write down the amendment that you're worried about and the list of 38 states that will approve it. And so far, I guess no one has risen to that challenge. The fourth and last rebuttal that the Convention of States movement offers to its objectors is the 1787 precedent is misread. The opponents frequently cite the 1787 Constitutional Convention as proof that conventions go rogue. After all, the delegates who went to that convention exceeded their original mandate from the Articles of Confederation and ended up doing something radically different. But the Convention of State scholars, including retired law professor Robert Nadelson, I hope I'm saying that right, argue that this comparison to the 1787 convention is flawed because the 1787 convention operated under the Articles of Confederation, not under Article 5 of the Constitution, and the ratification threshold was very different as well. So under today's Article 5 process, the 38 state ratification requirement provides a significant check that the Articles of Confederation never had. So based on all of that, I think our assessment of this steelman argument here that we're presenting is that the runaway convention fear is definitely worth taking seriously. And I think the Convention of States movement has taken it seriously. But when you examine it carefully, the multiple layers of protection, the limited mandate, the delegate recall authority, the 38 state ratification requirement, all of those things make a true runaway outcome extraordinarily unlikely. And I would offer that if 3/4 of the states were on board with some radical change, then that it would reflect the will of the vast majority, a supermajority of the country, at which point perhaps the Constitution should be changed, because the Constitution is supposed to express the will of the people. And the founders intended that it's a constitution for the living. I think Jefferson actually said that at some point. But the more realistic concern, I think, is not that a convention would go too far. It's that the opponents have used the fear of that possibility to prevent a legitimate constitutional tool from ever being used, thereby protecting the very federal overreach that the tool was designed to address. And so I find it worrisome when politicians like Mitch McConnell, for example, warn people away from Article 5 of the Constitution as if it's some dangerous thing that is to be viewed with suspicion and kid gloves. It's part of the Constitution. It's a legitimate constitutional provision that is available to the states, and so we shouldn't be afraid of it. Put simply, the founders gave us that tool. They built the safeguards into it, and the argument that we should never use it out of fear of some hypothetical abuse, I think is an argument for permanent federal entrenchment, which is exactly what opponents of reform want.
Okay, so let's compare the Convention of States with the NPVIC, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact connection. So it's a tale of two approaches. So we talked about in episode 39, the last episode, we talked all about the NPVIC. That was the whole focus of that episode. Both topics are fundamentally about constitutional amendment, but they represent opposite philosophies for how that change should happen. So a couple comparisons here. So for the NPVIC, the goal is to functionally eliminate the Electoral College, or the whole purpose of what the Electoral College is for. The Convention of States, its goal is to impose fiscal restraints, power limits, and term limits, which makes the Constitution better and gives states more rights effectively. The method for the NPVIC is this interstate compact, not using the constitutional amendment, not even using the Constitution at all for its process, and very arguably is against the Constitution because the Constitution talks about no interstate compacts, which is what this is. Convention of States, Article 5 Convention is literally a part of the Constitution. Article 5 is Article 5 in the Constitution, and it's one of the prescribed constitutional processes for introducing amendments. Constitutional role for NPVIC, no constitutional role whatsoever. Bypasses Congress and the Constitution entirely. Convention of States, Congress must call the convention once 34 states apply. Is ratification required for NPVIC? Nope. It automatically activates at 270 electoral votes. Once enough states that combine to equal 270 electoral votes, it automatically activates. The Article 5, yes, ratification, 38 states must ratify any proposed amendment. The partisan character of each of them, NPVIC is 100% Democrat-led. No Republican governors have signed on. The Article 5 is bipartisan grassroots, broad public support across party lines, as we talked about. Constitutional legitimacy, NPVIC has zero constitutional legitimacy. Some will say questionable. I say zero. It literally violates the compact clause in the spirit of Article 5, where the Convention of States explicitly authorized in Article 5 uses the prescribed process. And then Washington's test, the NPVIC fails. It's changed by usurpation, not amendment. And the Convention of States, it passes the test, uses the exact process Washington endorsed. So it's clear when you combine the two that the one we're talking about now, the Convention of States, Article 5, is, I mean, the name of it, Article 5, is an article in the Constitution. So it's literally the process, and the NPVIC is literally designed to bypass the Constitution, as we talked about in the last episode. The main argument for that movement is because it's too hard to pass an amendment. It requires too many states. And again, that's by design, because we don't want, the founders didn't want, and I think we should still not want, the Constitution to change too easily based on temporary whims of the nation. So the threshold should be higher, but it is achievable, as mentioned in the last episode. The last amendment was passed in the traditional method back in 1992, so not all that long ago. It can be done.
You raise an interesting point there, that you need go no further than the name of each of these movements to ascertain and discern their constitutional legitimacy. Article 5 movement literally refers to an article that spells out a provision in the Constitution. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact literally calls itself in its own name a thing that is prohibited by the Constitution, which is a compact between states without congressional approval. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. Great and astute observation. So the question, you just laid out this tale of two approaches, as you called it. The question about how we approach the Constitution and disagreements over its interpretation, the philosophies on how we amend it, and what to do when the government fails to uphold and honor and enforce that Constitution, that is a very important question. Article 5 gives us a peaceful mechanism by which we can address those concerns, making changes only when a very clear majority of the country, 3/4 of the states, 38 states, would have to agree, and the representatives of those states in the state legislatures would have to agree that that change is necessary. So Article 5 in the Constitution gives us a peaceful mechanism for resolving these things.
This was put in the Constitution specifically to allow people like us to wire around DC. The point was DC might break someday, and it might not be responsive to the people, and we might have to do something about that. And so that's why this provision of Article 5 was put in there.
We might have to do something about it peaceably and within the confines of the Constitution.
That's exactly right.
Looming in the background is always the threat, the nightmare scenario. People get so frustrated they start doing crazy, harmful things.
Absolutely.
To each other.
That's why, to me, right now, this is so important, because I don't like the pressure level in the country.
I agree with that.
I hate the fact that we hate each other so much.
That's right. I agree.
Look, every Supreme Court nomination is an existential war. Every presidential election is existential. Now we're down to individual Senate seats are existential. It's not healthy. Our attitude about Washington, D.C. was supposed to be, some stuff happens there. It's not all that important to my daily life.
That's right.
What matters is, if I really care, is what happens in my own community.
Yes.
And then maybe my county, and then maybe my state.
So the pressure in the country that he mentioned is the fact that we hate each other and can't seem to agree on what the Constitution even says, what it means, or how to resolve those differences. This threat that's looming in the background that Tucker mentioned. What happens when we can't reach a peaceful agreement on a proposed change or a needed change? The lack of support in either Congress or the states to achieve a change that one party or faction desires. That is also an important question that can have very dangerous answers. We've seen it in the past. The country's lived that nightmare before, and it still bears the scars. Take a look at this graphic for a moment, because it highlights, I think, one of the most overlooked constitutional realities of the last time we lived that nightmare. The Civil War, the war between the states. At the start of the war in 1861, the United States consisted of 34 states and some territories out west. 11 southern states seceded and formed the Confederacy, while 25 states, including some border states, remained loyal to the Union. And before the war, neither side had the constitutional numbers to settle the issue of slavery through an amendment. And both sides believed that they were defending the Constitution as they understood it. And so when we have different understandings of what the Constitution says and what it means, the Supreme Court offers some mechanism for resolving that, interpreting the Constitution. But when we can't decide, it requires a clarification to the Constitution, and that is typically done through an amendment. And so this issue of slavery that they could not agree on in terms of an interpretation of what the Constitution means, it led to the war. Because before the war, neither side had the constitutional numbers to settle that slavery question through an amendment. The southern states did not have enough states to permanently protect slavery through either of the two avenues outlined in Article 5. They didn't have the support in Congress, and they didn't have 3/4 of the states, or 2/3 to even call a convention, much less the 3/4 required to pass a proposed amendment. But the northern states didn't have that support either on their side to abolish slavery through the Constitution. Not through Congress, not through a convention of states. And I think that's an important point that I hadn't ever really considered before diving down this rabbit hole and studying for this. But under Article 5, it takes 2/3 of the states to propose an amendment and 3/4 of the states to ratify one. Before the war, neither side possessed those numbers. Now, here's why this graphic, I think, becomes important. Because when the southern states seceded, they didn't just magically disappear from the Constitution. Their congressional seats still constitutionally existed, but because those states were in rebellion, those seats became vacant. And that changed everything. Now the political math of what's required for an amendment to the Constitution becomes very different. In the House of Representatives, there were 81 seats that were tied to the Confederate states that just sat empty. In the Senate, there were 22 seats, 2 for each of the 11 states that seceded, that were vacant. So that dramatically shifted the balance of power in Washington. And you can see here in this graphic, in the upper right-hand table, the Constitution still authorized the full number of congressional seats based on the total number of states, but the Union effectively controlled the overwhelming majority of the seats that could actually be filled. Then, during the war, 2 new Union states were also added. West Virginia was added in 1863 and Nevada in 1864. That increased the Union representation even further. And suddenly the political math was very different. The vacancies that were left by the Confederate states gave the Union the congressional majority that it needed to pass the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. So in other words, the Civil War was not just fought on the battlefields. It was also a constitutional struggle over representation, political power, and ultimately the meaning of liberty itself. And one of the greatest historical ironies, I think, is that the act of secession that was intended to protect slavery actually created the conditions that weakened slavery's political power inside the constitutional system and helped create the conditions that led to its abolition. An interesting case study for sure. But the lesson, I think, is that we should be very wary when anyone suggests an end run around the Constitution, a rebellion against the Constitution, suggesting that we must violate or step outside of the Constitution in order to save it, subverting the Constitution's authority as the supreme law of the land and working to disadvantage states or their citizens without full transparency and debate and an opportunity to put that to a vote, either in Congress, by the states, or by the people themselves at the ballot box. And that is why the NPVIC is, I think, dangerous, because it's missing that last aspect. It is not doing this in a transparent way. It's not requiring any national debate. It doesn't require 2/3 of the country to discuss it. It doesn't require 3/4 of the states to ratify. It's just something that's being done kind of behind the back of the Constitution and getting very, very close to success. As we saw in last week's episode, they're only 48 electoral votes away from activating this unconstitutional interstate compact, which at the moment enjoys support from only 19 states or 22 states, depending on who you talk to. It's Michael Lester used the number 22, but from what I can see, it looks like 19. But either way, even if you go with the high number, 22 states, and there are 5 states currently considering it, and even if all 5 of them passed it, that's still only 27 states, which leaves them 7 states short of the 34 that would be required under Article 5 even to call a convention to discuss it and propose an amendment to eliminate the Electoral College. And they're nowhere close to the 38 states that would be required to ratify it. And they recognize that, and Michael Lester said as much in his interview with Sean Ryan, that a constitutional amendment to this effect, eliminating the Electoral College, he says God knows is nearly impossible. And so recognizing that they can't do it the right way by either of the mechanisms offered in Article 5, their solution is this interstate compact to do it outside of the Constitution, and that's dangerous. The merits of the individual goals of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact and the Convention of States, the merits of each of those aside, the principle is what matters here, I think. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, working outside the Constitution and seeking to functionally amend it without following the constitutionally prescribed process for doing so. And then the Convention of States, working within the Constitution, honoring and working to fulfill the requirements of Article 5 of the Constitution to drive the change that they believe is necessary. So understanding the opposition, we talked about it a little bit, but opponents of the Convention of States come from both the left and the right. Notably, some of these corners from the right, their objections, understanding their arguments, their motivations, I think it's useful for framing this episode. Again, for intellectual honesty, we never want to present just one side of the argument. And so we want to be forthcoming in the fact that there is opposition from both sides of the aisle to the Convention of States movement.
What you're proposing is kind of a species of that.
Yes,
It's a shock to the system.
absolutely.
It's the voice of ordinary people. It's a much more small d democratic way of governance.
They hate it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like really hate it. Like on the
Really
deep,
hate
because one thing they hate is democracy, and the more democratic it is, the more they hate
Yeah.
it. So what would the response be if this started to happen?
Well, we're already seeing it. I'll give you a specific example, and it's bipartisan, the hate, by the way. So Mitch McConnell,
Oh, I believe that.
Mitch McConnell is openly opposed to a convention of states.
On what grounds?
So I go to Kentucky, I'm in the legislature, and what they tell me point blank is that McConnell he comes in once a year and visits the legislature, and one of the things that he always says is, stay away from that Article 5 stuff. And it's
Meaning
real,
convention of states.
yeah, it's a real threat because he controls the political money in Kentucky. And so I have legislators telling me, look, Mark, we just can't touch this thing because, Uncle Mitch says that it's not acceptable.
So why would, Mitch McConnell, whatever his many faults, and I think he does have breakfast with Satan every Wednesday at the Four Seasons. It's been noted, but he's not stupid.
No.
So what would his justification be for opposing?
Well, I
Article
don't
5?
think he would say this out loud, but I don't think he wants the power taken away from Washington, D.C. He's a senator. This is a structural flaw. When we started electing senators get their power from D.C. Prior to the 17th Amendment, senators are appointed by state legislatures. That means the power of the Senate is in the states. And once they're elected, now their power base is in D.C. They serve their D.C. masters. They don't serve the states anymore.
So you said it's already started. Opposition to convention of states is already
So you got guys
alive.
like Mitch McConnell, and then on the left has gotten in full-blown opposition, especially in the last year. So you've talked about this on the show. There's an organization called Arabella Partners. That's like the center of the money operation on the left. Now, when I go into any state legislature, there will be a lobbyist hired by some arm of Arabella lobbying against us in the state legislatures. You have League of Women Voters is against us. All the left-wing organizations.
League of Women Voters?
The Sierra Club comes out and
The
testifies.
Sierra Club? On what grounds?
It's an environmental issue. I don't, honestly, I don't know, but they come and they testify.
What's the carbon footprint of a convention of
Yeah,
states?
exactly. I don't know what the issue is specifically. I think this is, and I'm not making a joke about this is intersectional politics of the left, right? So their belief is if it's a left-wing thing, it doesn't matter what your individual issue is, you support the left-wing thing. So obviously you've got Sierra Club, that's a left-wing organization. And so when the left-wing organizations like Arabella say this is a bad thing and they put it up on the scoreboard, then groups like Sierra Club are going to come out in opposition against it. League of Women Voters, contrary to what they try to present themselves, they're a left-wing organization.
I hope that they're identified as such, right? Are they still?
No, in the
They still
legislature.
sponsor debates and all that.
Oh yeah, they still do all of that.
Do they really?
Yeah. So they try to present themselves as a nonpartisan organization. If you look at what they lobby on, it's all partisan stuff. And so the sort of the pinnacle of this, Hillary Clinton has spoken out against us directly. 5 years ago on Good Friday, every leftist organization in America that you would know of signed a joint press release. It was sponsored by Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's La Raza, it's MoveOn.org, it's Planned Parenthood.
On what grounds?
It's the most dangerous thing that could possibly happen in the United States of America is what they
And but what's their argument? How can they justify that? It's in the Constitution.
What they say is it could be a runaway convention and we could lose our beloved Constitution. And you know how much they love the Constitution. And now we have a few on the right that oppose us because of that. The left is entirely unified against us. This year, just a few months ago, Senator Russ Feingold, former senator from Wisconsin, full-blown communist, wrote an entire book attacking Convention of States.
He wrote a book on
a
it.
whole book on why this was such a bad idea, why it was the most dangerous thing that could possibly happen. And actually, I read the book. Historically, it's a pretty good book, except for then he goes on to attack that we shouldn't be doing it now, using the age-old trope, we're going to lose our beloved Constitution.
You're going to lose your beloved Constitution by exercising the Constitution.
Correct.
I just think that doesn't, it just
Makes no sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Correct. Fear is a powerful elixir. If you can sell fear, then that's easy to sell. It's a lot easier to sell than reason.
So isn't that interesting that people like Mitch McConnell, their advice to the legislatures is stay away from that Article 5 stuff. So I would offer again, every elected official has sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And Mitch McConnell is not an exception to that. And here he is saying, without saying so, I swore to support the Constitution of the United States in this elected office, except for this part in Article 5 that could threaten my own power. So I'm for the Constitution in every way that it helps me, but anything that might reduce the amount of power that I have, I need you to stay away from that part of the Constitution. And as Tucker Carlson brought out at the end of that clip, the fear, actually he and Mark Meckler both talked about this. Mark Meckler said that the fear that they instill in people that somehow this provision in Article 5 is dangerous and it threatens the Constitution. We're going to lose our beloved Constitution by exercising a provision that's in the Constitution. That does not make any sense. And anytime someone is steering us away from a provision in the Constitution that is designed to help and protect us, the people, and the states, it makes me very suspicious of that person. We mentioned earlier that the John Birch Society is one of the groups on the right that opposes Mark Meckler and the Convention of States effort. Christian Gomez of the New American Magazine interviewed Dr. Robert Brown, who is a constitutional expert and scholar who volunteers his time speaking for the John Birch Society on the Constitution. Dr. Brown did not have anything good to say about Tucker Carlson or Mark Meckler or the Convention of States. Fundamentally, he disagrees with Meckler's framing that we have a structural problem, not a personnel problem. He takes objection to the idea that the Constitution needs to be changed or that the proposed changes would have any positive effect at all. Take a look.
And this is just one thing that I wish people like Tucker Carlson would do their homework before putting Mark Meckler on there and just letting him run with and believing everything Meckler has to say. You really need to study both sides of the issue. Or perhaps Tucker Carlson needs to have me on there as the counterpoint, showing the other side of the argument, because there are two strong sides to this. And if you haven't done your homework, one side sounds pretty good until you hear the rest of the story here.
One of the main objections raised by Dr. Brown in his interview with Christian Gomez is related to the first of the three subject areas that is targeted for proposed amendments by the Convention of States movement, and that is the fiscal restraint on the federal government. Mark Meckler stated that had a Convention of States been called in 1982, and it very nearly was, but Mark Meckler says had that Convention of States succeeded, had it been called and had they been able to propose and ratify the amendment that they were seeking to pursue at that point for fiscal responsibility, fiscal restraint, Mark Meckler says, had we been able to do that, we would have avoided the explosive national debt that now stands arguably as one of the largest threats to national security that we face at the moment. Check it out.
So that's the process that Mason proposed. It gets put in unanimously. We've never used it, and we've come close. In 1982, we almost got to the requisite 2/3 of states calling for a convention for a balanced budget. And then unfortunately, some folks on the right and some folks on the left actually both worked against it. We got to 32 out of the requisite 34 states, and then it got pushed back and a couple of states rescinded. And by the way, our debt at that point was a mere $4 trillion. So here we are, whatever it is now, $27 trillion further down the road since 1982, further in the hole, because they didn't have the wherewithal to call a convention of states.
So he said 27 trillion, but that interview was 3 years ago, and we are now, surpassing 36 trillion. But anyway, Dr. Brown, again, who often speaks for the John Birch Society, Dr. Brown maintains that such an amendment that, as Mark Meckler was describing back in 1982, would not have made a difference then, and it would not make a difference now in terms of curtailing federal spending. Here's his argument.
And speaking of a balanced budget amendment, around also in the same interview, around the 20-minute, 30-second mark of that interview, Mark Meckler discusses how in 1982 there were about 32 states that had applied for a convention specifically to propose a balanced budget amendment, as you were discussing, to our Constitution. And Meckler says that at the time we had merely about $4 trillion of a deficit, and now it's $27 trillion later. So
National debt there, but yeah.
So playing devil's advocate a little bit here. So shouldn't we have a balanced budget amendment added to the Constitution, especially now considering how high the national deficit has increased since then? What is your take on what on Meckler's position there?
Yeah, and just for clarification, I often mix up the words, but to make it clear, our national debt was around $4 trillion, not the deficit. But of course, the deficit continuing to add to the national debt. But the point he's making here is deceptive, and I'm going to call this one out. Back in 1982, we were 2 states away from having enough applications for a convention. It takes 34 states applying for the convention. And he's implying that here we were at the time, $4 trillion in debt. Because they didn't have this convention back then, we're now 27 trillion deeper in debt. And one simple question, how many years, if that convention had passed the balanced budget amendment they were proposing, how many years since then would Congress have been required to balance the budget? Because one thing it has in there is it says we want an amendment that requires Congress to balance the budget in the absence of a national emergency. So how many years since 1982 have we had an absence of a national emergency and Congress would have been required to balance the budget? And the answer is 0.
Absolutely.
We have not had...
Just the following year, you have the shoot down of the flight with Congressman Larry McDowell, Korean Airline Flight 007. That would be already a national emergency. We cut off ties with the USSR. The Gulf-Persian War, Gaddafi's...
There's always an excuse for national emergency, and that's the point. Yeah,
the Taliban, USS Cole, 9/11.
I read an article recently showing that we've actually been under constant state of national emergency since 1979. And so even if they had passed this application and passed this amendment they were proposing back in 82, Congress would not have been required to balance the budget even once. It's a fraud. It's an absolute fraud. And yet Meckler throws that out there as if, had we done this, we should have done this, we wouldn't be in the debt we are. Actually, we would. It wouldn't have made any difference at all. But it could have caused deeper problems than what we have currently.
So he might actually have a point there in terms of how that amendment that was proposed back in 1982, at least the way it was worded, might not have had the effect that Mark Meckler indicated that it would have. Maybe that's more of an issue with the wording of the amendment than the efficacy of the idea itself of an amendment that imposes fiscal restraint. What do you think?
Yeah, and that's a distinction that, of course, that's the beauty of this Article 5 convention system, is that this is the kind of detail that they could dialogue and talk about and get the nuance just right and get the wording right, to where they all agree, or they won't agree and it won't pass. So that's what's beautiful about the process, again, compared to the NPVIC, which just kind of triggers automatically without any debate or dialogue, in a formal sense.
Yeah.
The system is designed to work out these details. So if there's any hole or oversight in the current proposal, it would be addressed in the Convention of States.
That's a really good point, because Dr. Brown's point is perhaps a bit deceptive as well, because this never got to go to a convention. Like they both said, they were 2 states short. So this was never debated at a convention because the convention was never called. And you can almost guarantee that Dr. Brown's objection to the wording and how it wouldn't have the intended effect, almost guaranteed that would have been brought up at convention and debated. And who knows, the convention may have resolved that change the wording of that proposed amendment to alleviate that concern and prevent that outcome, we'll never know because the convention was never called.
Right. Yeah. So there's, of course, left-wing opposition and right-wing opposition to this convention of states. So I'll address the summarize the left-wing opposition first. So there's a couple progressive groups. One is called Common Cause. So Common Cause frames the effort as a power grab by, quote, wealthy special interests and radical far-right actors seeking to reshape the Constitution for their own benefit. They characterize the convention of state leadership as connected to Project 2025. If you remember that, before the Trump's election, Project 2025 was all in the news, which is I can't remember the name of the organization, Federalist Society, I think, or no, Heritage Foundation. Foundation is known to be kind of a main author of the Project 2025, and describe the effort as top-down and dark money funded rather than genuinely grassroots. Again, talking about Common Cause here. Their core fear is that a convention could gut the Bill of Rights, eliminate social safety net protections, or entrench right-wing agenda permanently into the constitutional text. This framing reflects a political calculation more than a legal one. Common Cause never explains how a constitutional amendment gutting the Bill of Rights would be ratified by 38 states. It's crazy to think that that would happen, including California, New York, Illinois, and every other blue state in the union. Their, quote, no rules claim also ignores extensive legal scholarship on the scope limiting effect of state applications. So again, the system is designed to prevent crazy ideas that wouldn't be accepted by the appropriate number of states and the legislatures within the states, and it would all be debated and fleshed out. So the Bill of Rights would not be threatened at all. So that's just kind of a summary of, I'm sure that maybe there's other opposition out there that kind of summarizes what we've seen in our research. And then right-wing opposition, there's some conservatives. I like the Birch Society. So the Birch Society is a conservative arm that you saw that some of their objections. And there's some other, on the right, some intellectually honest concerns. So the Republican National Committee has maintained a standing resolution against an Article 5 convention since 2012, which is interesting. The Idaho GOP passed a resolution opposing it in 2025, so just last year. These voices share convention of states goals, such as reining in federal power, balancing the budget, term limits, things like that, but argue the convention mechanism is too unpredictable and that better solutions exist through elections and judicial appointments. This is the more serious objection and deserves a direct answer. Elections and judicial appointments have been tried for decades. The federal government continues to grow. The debt continues to climb. Congress continues to exempt itself from the limitations it imposes on everyone else. If elections alone were sufficient, they would have worked by now. It's not working. The founders gave us Article 5 for exactly the situation. And I will add, there have been a lot of Supreme Court cases decided in the last several years that have been good at reining in some federal overreach, such as the Exxon, forget what it's called, the Exxon case, which basically Chevron case, thank you, which up until that case, it was just a couple of years ago that was decided. These unelected federal agencies were given enormous power to basically write law without going through Congress. And the Supreme Court was just giving them a pass for decades. And the Chevron case was overturned that. Also, recently, the Lemon test has been overturned by the Supreme Court. They've doubled down, tripled down on religious freedom and freedom of speech. especially since the COVID restrictions in 2021, 2022. So the Supreme Court has done a lot of things to rein in federal power, but they can't. They're not powerful, nor should they be powerful enough to do all of it on their own, and they can't. They can't. They can only around the edges improve things a little bit, and they have, but they can't do it alone, nor should they do it alone. They should not have the power. They don't have the power to rein in all these concerns that we're talking about. So the Article 5 Convention of States appears to be the only plausible solution, and it's a viable solution to address these issues.
Yeah, that is a really good observation on your part. The thing that you mentioned about the Republican National Committee sharing the Convention of States objectives of reining in federal power, balancing the budget, and establishing term limits. They share those objectives, but as you said, they argue that the Convention of States mechanism is too unpredictable, and so they're not on board with that. Unfortunately for them, there are only two mechanisms available at all. The one hasn't worked in years and years and years, and they're too wary to try the other. And so we're at an impasse. And that's unfortunate, because as you said, the method that they are comfortable with has proven to be completely futile and ineffective. So those are the objections that you laid out from both the left and the right. Mark Meckler and the Convention of States, their response, they've addressed the conservative opposition directly and repeatedly. His essential argument, and we heard him say this, that it's very easy to sell fear. It's easier to sell fear than reason. And the fear of a runaway convention is being weaponized by the very people who benefit from federal entrenchment, like Mitch McConnell. And for those who are concerned about a runaway convention, I would ask them what their concern is with regard to a runaway Congress, which seems to be what we have at the moment. As you pointed out, the cost of inaction has resulted in a $36 trillion national debt, a virtually untouchable regulatory state, career politicians who seem to serve for life in some cases, and they're completely insulated from the consequences of their decision. Was it Thomas Sowell that talked about the lunacy of allowing people to make decisions for which they don't have to suffer the consequences, something to that effect. So the current situation is already catastrophic, I would argue. And the alternative, the Convention of States, I can't imagine being any worse than what we have at the moment. And we are protected by that safeguard that it would require 3/4 of the state legislatures to agree before anything at all changes. Only 13 states have to say no to keep the status quo exactly as it is. So I don't see how this hurts us in any way. And if 38 states do agree to it, then that indicates that that's the direction that the vast majority of the country wants to move. So despite the opposition from both sides, Mark Meckler is very optimistic that a convention of states will occur in our lifetime. Check it out.
What do you think, as a practical matter, the chances are in our lifetimes?
You know, it's first of all, to be fair, I'm a glass half full kind of person.
Yes.
I appreciate when you filled me up here.
Good.
That's my logo right there. And so I believe we're going to make it happen. If I had to give it an odds, I'm going to say 90%. And the reason that I say that is because we've polled it, and literally 2/3 plus of Americans are in favor of doing this when they find out what it's about. And that goes across party lines. It's over 75% of Republicans. It's about 66% of independents. It's 52% of Democrats are in favor of it when they know what it is. So the American public wants this, and the American public is more and more fed up with Washington, D.C. every day.
So interestingly, as Mark Meckler points out, the Convention of States movement, surprisingly, has some bipartisan support. Here's what Mark Meckler had to say about progress that's being made even in Democrat legislatures where this idea of convention of states is concerned. Take a look.
How receptive are states with Democratic governors?
Very little. I mean, to put it bluntly, there are exceptions though. And I'm really excited about the exceptions. I'll give you a great exception. And it depends on how good, frankly, and how hard our grassroots teams work to build relationships in the legislature. I think sometimes we forget, it's easy to forget, politicians are human beings first, right? And so we tend to caricaturize.
They don't seem human,
Right.
but you're right.
That's
You're
exactly
right,
what
Mark.
we do, right? I mean, but that is true. So we think, they're, whatever we call them, they're slime balls. They're all corrupt. They're all terrible. Some of them are our heroes, and that's not correct either.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so what we do is we set them up in these particular categories, and we fail to treat them like people. If we go into a legislature and we treat the Democratic legislators like people, we end up with support among Democrats. An example is in Massachusetts. In the last cycle, we passed the Convention of States resolution out of 2 committees. We don't normally do that. That was the first time ever. But our grassroots were so effective at building relationships with Democrat legislators that the Democrats were willing to listen, and they ultimately bought into what their constituents were saying, and they were willing to take these votes and pass it out of committee. Now, we didn't pass the legislature, but that was incredible progress in a democratically controlled legislature, and I believe there'll be more of that as time goes on.
Yeah, in Massachusetts, that's amazing.
So it's interesting to see these two movements that we've been discussing, the Convention of States movement and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's interesting to see those two movements side by side. So you can see on the graphic here that as of 2026, there appears to be no states that have both. There's virtually no overlap. No state has officially passed the Convention of State Article 5 resolution and also enacted the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. That overlap is essentially zero because those two movements tend to draw support from very different political coalitions with very different perspectives and philosophy on the Constitution, on how it should be amended and what you should do if you don't have the juice to amend it. The Convention of States support is concentrated primarily in Republican-controlled states and operates squarely within the confines of the Constitution, while the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact support is concentrated primarily in Democrat-controlled states and operates exclusively outside of the Constitution. However, there are a few states that create an interesting partial overlap. States that have passed the Convention of States and are also considering the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. That's interesting. Arizona, Wisconsin. And then you have states that are supporting the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact while also deliberating on the Convention of States. Virginia being the biggest example. Virginia is now part of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, sadly. Virginia has also periodically been listed as an active or target state for the Convention of State efforts. So politically, these two maps are almost mirror images of each other. The Convention of State strength is primarily concentrated in the South, in the plains, in the mountain areas out west. Kind of that area that is largely neglected by by what would be accomplished through the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, whose strength, the NPVIC strength, is largely in the Northeast, on the West Coast, the Upper Midwest, and in Democratic-leaning states, and specifically Democratic-leaning states with large Democratic-leaning population centers and metropolitan areas. So that contrast actually makes a very fascinating side-by-side constitutional graphic for discussion. One movement seeking to use Article 5 to restrain federal power, the other seeking to use an interstate compact in violation of the Constitution to effectively nationalize presidential elections and focus it in these population centers, and to do so without a constitutional amendment. So it's a fascinating thing to see side by side there, I thought.
Yeah, shows the contrast and the overlap, like you said, very, very well. And it kind of, I don't know, it kind of shows in one graphic the two different approaches and how the desire is not mutually exclusive. The desire is for a better functioning country. One takes an approach that's very partisan and outside the Constitution, and one does the opposite. It takes a bipartisan approach. It may be mostly led by conservative folks, but it's bringing in a lot of left-leaning folks that just want more states' rights and via constitutional means to actually make lasting changes to the Constitution that most of the country by design will have to agree with. So two very clear contrasts there. So we're going to talk about just some other ideas. So the Convention of States just has those three main areas that we talked about. But as Mark Meckler talked about in some of those clips, there's a lot of other ideas out there that I think are worth considering adding to an eventual Convention of States that we'll throw out there.
So what would we want a Convention of States to accomplish were one to be called? So Mark Meckler laid out the three broad subject areas that should be covered: fiscal constraints on the federal government, limiting the scope of the federal government, and term limits, right? So within that framework, some things to consider. 1, proportional electoral college apportionment, requiring all states to allocate electoral votes proportionally based on the state's popular vote results, which is the intent of the Electoral College. That's why the framers put it there, to protect states so that the Electoral College represents the will of the population of the individual states. It retains state sovereignty and gives every state a meaningful voice. That's the whole point of it. So if it's necessary to clarify that, which apparently it is, because the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact seems to believe that it's a legitimate use of Electoral College votes to give them all away to the national popular vote winner. So maybe that's something that needs to be clarified in the Constitution via an amendment. Broad authority still needs to be given to the states, as it already is in the Constitution, on how they conduct elections, how they appoint their electors, but specifying the purpose of the Electoral College and the purpose of those electors to represent the will of the state, not the popular vote of the nation. I think that could be a legitimate use of the Convention of States. Second, repeal of the 17th Amendment, restoring the original design of U.S. senators being appointed by the state legislatures rather than by direct popular election. That was another mechanism originally that gave states a voice in the federal government because they had hooks in the Senate and made those senators much more responsive to the desires and the needs of the state. And that's not the case currently because of how we now elect senators. This was the founders' mechanism for ensuring that states have direct representation in the federal government. And after the 17th Amendment in 1913, the state's check on federal power was significantly weakened. So here's a brief explanation of the 17th Amendment and the impact that it's had on the state's check on federal power. Take a look.
Can you just pause for a second? Yeah. So the idea of the 17th Amendment was we're going to make the system more democratic with direct election of senators, but you're saying it made it less democratic.
Yeah, I don't think it was out of poor motive. I mean, what they saw, there was a perception that rich, powerful people got appointed to the United States Senate, that you had to have notoriety and have money and be successful already to get appointed. That was true. And so we flipped it on its head and said, well, let's just have people who get elected and that'll fix the problem. And now today, well, you need to be rich and powerful and have notoriety to get elected, right? So we didn't fix the system at all, but we introduced some really bad structural flaws, which is human beings, we're just incentive machines.
Yes.
The system, you set up a system that incents certain behavior and people will behave in that way. So the behavior now is, well, I like power. Most people, humans, are wired to like power. my power is in DC, so I want the power in DC. That's where the Senate is. I don't want it back in my state. Well, I don't want it back in my state. If I'm a U.S. Senator, I don't really have influence in my state. I have influence in Washington.
Yes. No, so smart.
And so the structure got flipped in a way that incentivized a power buildup in Washington, D.C. by the United States Senate.
So that's interesting. And from my perspective, that seems to be accurate.
Yeah.
A third potential action for a convention of states is an amendment that would require a supermajority for any federal tax increase, require 2/3 majority in both chambers to raise federal taxes, making it structurally harder for Congress to fund its expansion just simply by raising taxes or log rolling omnibus spending. And this particular recommendation may be a moot point if they were to repeal the 16th Amendment, which is the federal income tax. So that's an interesting idea. A fourth potential objective, line item veto for the president. So allowing the president to veto specific spending items within a bill rather than having to accept or reject the entire legislation. Madison and the founders, I think, were deeply concerned about log rolling or omnibus spending. So I think that would be a good use of the Convention of States. Judicial term limits or mandatory retirement age. Limit the Supreme Court justices and federal judges to fixed terms. 12, 14, 16, 18 years, something. I don't know. Other than the current lifetime tenure that they enjoy, even though the Constitution doesn't specifically say they serve for life, they serve during good behavior. But essentially, it turns into a lifetime tenure. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of that one because it's so contentious when any Supreme Court justice is considered by any president. It's
Yep.
because it's a lifetime appointment, and it just again it's something that I think divides the country. But if each appointment was only for 20 years, 10 years, whatever, for a limited term, it wouldn't be such a heavy thing, and you can predict when their term will expire, and it's more predictable and it's less by chance, when they retire, when they die, and if it was offset from a presidential cycle, 4 years or 8 year term, if it was 10 or 18 or something like that, I think it adds more of that kind of variety to our overall system of checks and balances, and it wouldn't be such a divided or divisive issue.
Yeah. And I don't know what the correct term would be for the limit, how many years that would be. It needs to be short enough to where we avoid this existential freak out panic moment every time we have to appoint one, because we realize that under the current construct anyway, that person's going to be there until they die. So short enough to avoid that, but long enough to ensure that the justices aren't swayed by every mood of the moment that comes along, which was the reason for the current way that we operate. What other ideas would you have for the Convention of States?
So just a few more. So basically, there's the idea of a state veto of federal legislation. So again, giving states more power. It would allow a supermajority of states, so 3/5 of the states, to nullify a federal law or regulation, which would restore the federalism balance that Madison described in Federalist Number 51. And again, it's just an idea, but allows just another check and balance to what the Congress does. Then another idea is balanced budget with a debt ceiling enforcement. So stronger than a simple balanced budget amendment, this includes enforceable consequences such as automatic spending cuts, no new appropriations that could be triggered when the debt ceiling is reached, rather than allowing Congress to simply raise the debt ceiling over and over again. So those are just 7 ideas, and there's other ones that are out there. I think those ones, or a majority of those ones, I think would be would appeal to a majority of the country, in my opinion. And again, this gives more more checks and balances to our government system, as well as giving the states more power, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and maybe if we have an amendment where a balanced budget is required, anytime Congress fails to pass a balanced budget when the Constitution requires one, every sitting member of Congress is no longer eligible for re-election in the next election. Let's go for that.
I like it.
Immediate consequences for failing to uphold your constitutional duty. So what's your bottom line assessment of all of this, man?
So bottom line, I'd say, Convention of States under Article 5 is not a radical idea. It is the founders' own solution written into the Constitution to the problem of federal overreach. It was written in there at the insistence of George Mason, and he was very wise. Explained and defended by Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, and designed with redundant safeguards against abuse. The fact that it has never been used is not evidence that it shouldn't be used. It is evidence of how successfully the political class has protected itself from it.
Yeah. Yep.
The three reforms the Convention of States is currently pursuing, fiscal restraints, power limitations, and term limits, enjoy broad public support across party lines, which is evidenced by the states that are considering it across party lines. They address structural problems that elections alone have failed to fix. The national debt is not a partisan talking point. It's a $36 trillion obligation being handed to future generations without their consent. And by the way, that's a topic of another episode I want to pursue, is the impact of the debt we have and how it's crowding out necessary spending in other areas. The expansion of unelected federal regulatory power is not abstract. It affects every business, every family, and every community in America.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll add to that the runaway convention fear is the primary weapon used by those who benefit from the status quo. The status quo, which is to prevent this tool from ever being deployed. When you examine that carefully, though, I think with this 38-state ratification requirement as the ultimate backstop, it's, to me at least, it's not a very persuasive reason to leave this constitutional tool locked in the toolbox. 13 states, any 13 states can stop any amendment. California alone can anchor a coalition of 13 states. The idea that the convention would produce amendments that destroy the Bill of Rights, that 38 states would then ratify, I don't think that's a serious scenario, not a serious objection. The contrast with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is I think instructive. It's worth making that contrast explicitly in this episode. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact bypasses the amendment process altogether, a point that we've made probably ad nauseum by this time, using this backdoor legal maneuver to functionally rewrite the rules of presidential elections without actually having to go through this constitutional amendment process. The Convention of States uses the amendment process exactly as it's written in Article 5. One is usurpation. NPVIC, that's usurpation. The other, the Convention of States, is the Constitution working as it's designed to work. So the opposition to the use of the Convention of States, this perfectly legitimate constitutional provision, that opposition is real and it's very fierce. Proposing and advocating for it requires a great deal of courage. Sadly, it requires courage to actually stand up for the Constitution in America. Mark Meckler acknowledged the vicious attacks that he and others have endured simply because they are advocating for the use of this constitutional provision. But it also comes through very clearly Mark Meckler's commitment to the cause and his reasons. Take a look.
Any grassroots organizing, that's the threat.
Right.
I mean, you can go on cable news, I do every day, rah, 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 give me your views. But if you organize other people in alliance with those views, then you are absolutely a political threat to them. And
for sure.
You're the Proud Boys or whatever.
Yeah.
So, do you think you're vulnerable in that way? Absolutely. I mean, look, having the entire power of the federal government or state come after you, it's overwhelming. It's intimidating. I understand what it feels like, and yet we prepare for it. We have the lawyers on staff to handle it. We have outside counsel.
We've got a lot of allies out there. I've worked to build those allies over many years. It doesn't mean the fight won't come. And I warn our grassroots about this all the time. This is really important that people understand. This is not a joke. This is not a hobby. It's not some little sidelight you're going to do. And I warn people, look, you might lose your job. You might lose your career. You might get kicked out of your church. Your kids might get threatened at school. All of those things might happen. The question is, what are we fighting for? And what do we really believe in? Because if you go back to the founding of this country, they knew all that stuff and more. You know, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, there's my favorite language in there is it says that they pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor.
Yes.
We all know, we can all repeat that. It's a trope even at this
Yeah.
point. What most people don't know is it says that they pledge that to each other, not to the country, not to a flag, not to Washington or the army, none of that stuff, to each other. And that's what we talk about in our organization. I think this is really important for those of us who are conservatives and are in what I would call movement politics is, do we have each other's back?
Yes.
Because what I say to my people, and I literally every night before I go to bed, I look in the mirror and I say, I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to everybody who's watching right now, to you individually, that when the fight comes, I will step in to the extent I can. I can't fix everything. I can't save everybody. But personally, I'll use my own resources, my own assets, my own time. And that's what I ask of our people is pledge your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor, not to me, not to the organization, not to the country, but to everybody who is fighting with you. If we are going to save the republic, it's going to take that kind of courage and that kind of commitment. It's not some halfway, we're going to do this little thing on the side while we go have a good time with our families. It's not going to work that way.
To that, I would say, amen. Whether you agree with Mark Meckler or not, you have to hand it to him. You can't doubt his courage or his commitment. And I happen to agree with him. The founders gave us Article 5 because they knew this day that we are living in would come. And the only question is whether this generation, our generation, has the courage and the will to use it. So as we close, I think it's worth stepping back and recognizing just how unusual this moment is in American history. The Constitution has endured for well over 200 years, not because Americans have always agreed, but because the Constitution gave us a peaceful process for resolving our disagreements. And that's important, especially now, because the pressure inside the country is real. Americans are increasingly disagreeing not only about policy, but about the meaning of the Constitution itself, about the limits of federal power, about the role of the states, about elections, about the courts, about liberty. And history teaches us that when a people loses confidence in their constitutional mechanisms for peaceful reform, the alternatives become very dangerous very quickly. And that is why Article 5 exists. The founders understood that someday Washington might refuse to correct itself. They understood that power naturally accumulates power. They understood that Congress would rarely volunteer to limit its own authority. And so they gave the states, and ultimately the people, a constitutional remedy. Not revolution, we already fought one of those. Not secession, that's already been tried. Not political violence, we see that playing out in front of us. They gave us a constitutional process, a lawful mechanism for peaceful structural reform. Now, whether you agree with the Convention of States movement or not, one thing should be obvious after today's discussion. It is not some fringe invention. It's not a loophole. It's not a rebellion against the Constitution. It's part of the Constitution itself, written by the founders, defended by James Madison, demanded by George Mason, and intentionally preserved as a final check against federal overreach. And that's what makes the contrast with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact so important, because ultimately this debate is about more than just term limits or balanced budgets or electoral systems. It's about whether constitutional change should occur through the Constitution or around it. One movement says the Constitution's outdated, it's inconvenient, and it has to be bypassed in order to achieve a desired outcome. The other says if change is necessary, then make the case openly, persuade the states, follow the constitutional process that the founders gave us. And I think that's a critically important distinction. Because once a nation begins convincing itself that constitutional shortcuts are justified for the right cause, then there will always be another right cause. And eventually the Constitution itself becomes just whatever temporary majorities decide that it is. That's not self-government. That is chaos. So perhaps the Convention of States movement succeeds. Maybe it fails. Perhaps the country ultimately decides that these reforms are wise, or maybe it just rejects them altogether. But that's exactly the point. Article 5 allows the American people, through their states, to debate those questions peacefully and constitutionally. The founders gave us that mechanism because they understood something many Americans today seem to have forgotten, that a constitutional republic survives only if its people are willing to preserve both liberty and the lawful process by which liberty is protected. And perhaps that's why James Madison warned that a great security against gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department rests in preserving the constitutional means to resist encroachment. That is the question today. Do we still believe that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land? Do we still believe constitutional change should happen constitutionally? And do we still possess the civic courage required to govern ourselves? We'll leave that for you to decide. Jim?
Thanks,
Good
Marcus.
time, man.
Yeah, great
Thank you.
episode. Learned a lot, enjoyed it. Hopefully the audience will too. And remember, audience, if you like this, please share it. Please like it. Put some comments. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Substack, Spotify, all the podcast platforms. You can listen and or you can watch. And if you watch, we share a lot of graphics that helps illustrate a lot of the points we're trying to make. So please share this, subscribe, like, comment, and we do the best we can to comment to every comment made.
So until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that freedom is never maintained by accident. It must be understood, defended, and forged. This is Fire for Effect. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Appreciate you guys.
See you next time. God bless.
God bless.